Sometimes the bravest question is the one asked with nothing left to lose. Naomi Carter stood alone beneath the warm glow of the hospital entrance as a cool spring breeze carried the scent of blooming magnolia trees across the nearly empty parking lot. She had spent the entire afternoon beside her grandmother's bed, listening to stories filled with hope, memories, and one gentle wish that refused to fade. Her grandmother had smiled weakly and whispered that before saying goodbye to this world, she only wanted to know her granddaughter would never have to face life alone. Naomi had smiled through tears and promised everything would be all right, even though she had no idea how she could ever make that promise come true. After leaving the hospital, she returned to the DeLuca estate just before sunset to complete her evening responsibilities. The grand residence overlooking the Hudson River remained as elegant as ever, with polished marble floors reflecting the fading golden light pouring through towering windows. Naomi moved quietly through each hallway, carrying freshly folded linens while greeting every member of the household with the same gentle warmth that had earned their respect. As a plus-size black maid, she had always believed that the greatest way to thank someone for giving her an opportunity was to perform every task with excellence. She never expected praise, and she never searched for attention. Yet behind her calm smile rested a heart weighed down by worry. Every passing hour reminded her that time with her grandmother was becoming more precious than ever. Later that evening, after the rest of the staff had finished their duties, Naomi remained inside the library arranging several books that had been left upon a large oak table. The room was peaceful, filled with the comforting scent of old leather bindings and polished wood. Rain began falling softly outside, tapping gently against the tall windows while the steady rhythm of an antique grandfather clock echoed through the silence. At that exact moment, Vincent DeLuca entered the library after returning from a series of business meetings across Manhattan. The White Mafia Boss carried the quiet confidence of a man whose reputation often arrived before he did. Yet those who truly knew him understood that beneath his calm authority lived a man who valued respect above fear. He noticed Naomi immediately and offered a polite greeting before reaching for a folder resting near the fireplace. Naomi looked at him for only a brief moment before lowering her eyes again. She knew how unreasonable the thought inside her mind sounded. Every sensible part of her wanted to remain silent. Yet another part remembered her grandmother's hopeful smile. Her hands tightened gently around the edge of the table as she gathered every ounce of courage she possessed. Vincent sensed the hesitation in her expression and calmly asked whether something was troubling her. The simple kindness in his voice dissolved the last barrier, holding her words back. Naomi slowly stepped forward, her heart pounding so loudly she wondered whether he could hear it. She apologized in advance if her request sounded foolish and admitted that she would completely understand if he refused. Vincent remained silent, giving her the patience to continue. Taking one slow breath, Naomi finally looked into his eyes and asked the question she never imagined she would say aloud. "Would you pretend to be my husband for one day?" The words hung quietly between them as the rain continued falling beyond the windows. Vincent neither laughed nor looked surprised. Instead, he studied the sadness behind her hopeful eyes, recognizing immediately that no one asked a question like that unless love, fear, or heartbreak had left them believing there was no other choice. He did not answer. He simply continued looking at her with calm understanding while the silence itself became heavier than any reply either of them could have spoken. The quiet silence inside the library seemed to stretch endlessly after Naomi Carter asked the impossible question. Rain continued tapping gently against the tall windows while the old grandfather clock marked each passing second with steady rhythm. Vincent DeLuca did not answer immediately. Instead, he studied the expression on her face, noticing that she was not embarrassed because she feared rejection. She was frightened because hope itself had become something fragile. After several long moments, Vincent calmly asked only one question. "Why?" Naomi lowered her eyes, clutching her hands together as though holding herself steady. She apologized once more for placing him in such an uncomfortable position and quietly explained that she had never intended to cross the boundaries between employer and employee. She had spent hours convincing herself to remain silent, yet every other possibility had disappeared before she found the courage to speak. Vincent remained completely still, allowing her the space to continue without interruption. Naomi slowly told him about her grandmother, Evelyn Carter, the woman who had raised her after both of her parents passed away during her teenage years. Evelyn had worked 2 jobs, sacrificed every comfort she could have enjoyed herself, and devoted her entire life to making certain Naomi would always know what unconditional love looked like. Even after age and illness weakened her body, Evelyn never complained. She simply smiled, encouraged everyone around her, and continued believing tomorrow would always bring another reason to be grateful. Only recently had the doctors gently explained that her remaining time was becoming uncertain. During every hospital visit, Evelyn spoke less about her own health and more about Naomi's future. She often worried that her granddaughter spent so much of her life caring for everyone else that she would someday find herself facing every challenge alone. The one dream she quietly carried inside her heart was seeing Naomi happily married to someone who respected her kindness instead of taking advantage of it. Naomi admitted she had never wanted to deceive her grandmother. She only wanted to give her peace during whatever time remained. She explained that she did not need an expensive ceremony, photographs, or elaborate stories. She only wished her grandmother could believe that the woman she had spent a lifetime protecting would never have to face the future without someone standing beside her. As she finished speaking, tears quietly gathered in her eyes, yet she never allowed them to fall. Vincent noticed that detail more than anything else. She had become so accustomed to carrying pain with quiet dignity that even heartbreak seemed carefully restrained. He asked whether she had anyone else who might help. Naomi smiled sadly before shaking her head. She had no fiancé, no close relatives nearby, and no lifelong friend she could ask to pretend in such a deeply personal moment. Everyone she cared about already carried burdens of their own, and she refused to ask them to carry another. That was why she had almost buried the idea forever. Only after remembering how calmly Vincent treated every person working inside the estate had she believed there might be a small chance he would at least listen before refusing. Vincent walked slowly toward the large library window overlooking the rain-covered gardens. He remained silent for several thoughtful moments, looking beyond the glass while considering everything Naomi had shared. His reputation had taught the world to expect quick decisions. Yet the people who truly understood him knew he never rushed matters involving another person's dignity. Finally, without turning around, he quietly asked one final question. "If I agree, will this bring your grandmother peace?" Naomi answered almost immediately. "More than anything else in the world." Vincent slowly closed his eyes for only a brief moment before opening them again. When he finally turned back toward her, the calm expression on his face revealed nothing about the decision already beginning to form inside his heart. Yet for the first time since entering the library, Naomi felt that perhaps hope had not disappeared after all. Vincent DeLuca remained quietly standing beside the library window while the rain gradually softened into a gentle mist that blurred the lights beyond the estate gardens. When he finally turned toward Naomi Carter, there was no hesitation left in his expression. He spoke with the calm certainty that had defined every important decision of his life. He told her he would help, but only if they built their agreement upon honesty instead of unnecessary deception. He explained that they would never invent an extravagant story or create false promises that would eventually bring more pain. They would simply allow her grandmother to see 2 people who genuinely respected one another. Naomi stared at him in silent disbelief, hardly able to process the kindness she had just received. She thanked him repeatedly, her voice trembling with relief, but Vincent gently interrupted before she could apologize once again. He quietly reminded her that gratitude should never become another burden she felt obligated to carry. The following afternoon, after completing their responsibilities at the estate, they drove together to the hospital overlooking the Hudson River. During the drive, Vincent asked simple questions instead of rehearsing imaginary conversations. He wanted to know Evelyn Carter as a person rather than as part of a performance. Naomi smiled for the first time in days as she described her grandmother's love of gospel music, homemade peach cobbler, neighborhood gardening clubs, and the way she always insisted that kindness was the only wealth no one could ever lose. Vincent listened carefully, remembering every detail without writing anything down. By the time they reached the hospital, he realized he no longer felt as though he were preparing to play a role. He simply wanted to honor the remarkable woman who had raised Naomi into the compassionate person she had become. Inside the hospital room, warm afternoon sunlight spilled across the blanket covering Evelyn's bed. Although illness had weakened her body, her eyes immediately brightened the moment Naomi entered the room. When Vincent stepped quietly inside beside her, Evelyn looked between them with gentle curiosity. Naomi introduced Vincent with visible nervousness, explaining that she wanted someone very important to meet her grandmother. Vincent approached respectfully, shook Evelyn's hand with genuine warmth, and thanked her for welcoming him. There was no dramatic performance, no exaggerated affection, and no attempt to impress anyone. Instead, he pulled a chair beside the bed, asked Evelyn about the photographs displayed near the window, and listened as she shared stories about Naomi's childhood, school recitals, church picnics, and every dream she had encouraged her granddaughter to pursue. As the conversation unfolded, Naomi watched something unexpected happen. Vincent, the man the world described as distant and intimidating, laughed softly at Evelyn's gentle jokes, admired her resilience, and treated every memory she shared as though it were a priceless treasure. Evelyn soon reached across the bed and quietly placed her hand over Naomi's before looking toward Vincent with peaceful eyes. She said that anyone could recognize genuine respect because it appeared in the smallest moments rather than the loudest words. Naomi felt her heart tighten, wondering whether her grandmother somehow understood more than either of them intended to reveal. Before leaving, Vincent adjusted Evelyn's blanket after noticing it had slipped from her shoulder, wished her a peaceful evening, and promised they would visit again soon. As he and Naomi walked silently through the hospital corridor afterward, neither of them spoke for several moments. Finally, Naomi admitted that nothing about the afternoon had felt like pretending. Vincent looked ahead with quiet thoughtfulness before answering that perhaps the easiest kindness to believe was the one that had never required acting in the first place. Without realizing it, both of them carried the same unexpected feeling home that evening, the quiet realization that somewhere between honesty, compassion, and shared purpose, the line separating obligation from genuine connection had already begun to disappear. Over the following week, what had begun as a simple promise slowly settled into a quiet routine neither Vincent DeLuca nor Naomi Carter had expected. They visited Evelyn Carter together every evening after Naomi finished her responsibilities at the estate, never arriving with elaborate gifts or rehearsed conversations. Instead, they brought ordinary moments that somehow became extraordinary simply because they were shared. Vincent often carried fresh flowers from the estate gardens because Evelyn once mentioned how much she missed tending roses outside her old home. Naomi usually arrived with homemade soup prepared from her grandmother's favorite family recipe. They sat beside her bed listening to stories that wandered through decades of laughter, sacrifice, faith, and family traditions. Every visit seemed to leave Evelyn smiling a little longer than before. One afternoon, while sunlight poured through the hospital windows, Evelyn looked at both of them with quiet amusement before asking how they had first met. Naomi froze for an instant, realizing they had never prepared an answer. Before anxiety could overwhelm her, Vincent smiled gently and answered with complete honesty, although not in the way anyone expected. He explained that they met because life had placed two people from completely different worlds beneath the same roof, and over time he learned that the strongest people were often the ones who asked for recognition the least. Naomi looked toward him with quiet surprise because every word he had spoken was true. He had simply left out the details that did not matter. Evelyn laughed softly and remarked that every lasting relationship she had ever known began with respect before affection. Hearing those words, neither Naomi nor Vincent spoke. They simply exchanged a brief glance before looking back toward Evelyn. As the days passed, the hospital staff gradually began greeting Vincent by name. Nurses smiled whenever he quietly refilled Evelyn's water pitcher or adjusted the curtains so afternoon sunlight would not shine directly into her eyes. He never behaved as though kindness deserved attention. He simply noticed small needs before anyone asked. Naomi observed those moments carefully, realizing that the man the public described as intimidating possessed a remarkable gift for making other people feel seen without expecting gratitude in return. One evening, after leaving the hospital, they stopped at a neighborhood diner because Naomi admitted she had skipped dinner while helping another patient find her family earlier that afternoon. Sitting across from one another in a quiet booth, They spoke less about the arrangement between them and more about ordinary life. Naomi shared childhood memories of baking peach pies with her grandmother every summer, while Vincent admitted that peaceful evenings had become rare since taking responsibility for his family's business years earlier. Their conversation flowed naturally, interrupted only by comfortable silence and quiet smiles. Neither of them noticed how little they referred to the agreement that had first brought them together. As they walked back toward Vincent's car beneath a sky filled with stars, Naomi quietly apologized once again for drawing him into something so personal. Vincent gently shook his head before answering that helping someone honor the person who raised them was never an inconvenience. He then looked toward the quiet city lights stretching across the horizon and admitted something that surprised even himself. He said the hospital visits no longer felt like fulfilling a promise. They felt like somewhere he genuinely wanted to be. Naomi did not answer immediately. Instead, she smiled softly, realizing that the distance between pretending and believing had become far smaller than either of them had ever intended. And somewhere inside her heart, a hope she had promised herself never to trust again was beginning to bloom with quiet, undeniable certainty. As the days quietly unfolded, neither Vincent DeLuca nor Naomi Carter noticed the exact moment when their carefully defined arrangement stopped feeling like an agreement and began feeling like an ordinary part of life. Every evening after work, they drove together to the hospital, shared conversations with Evelyn Carter, and returned to the estate beneath the peaceful glow of city lights reflecting across the Hudson River. There were no dramatic promises and no carefully rehearsed displays of affection. Instead, there were countless small moments that carried more meaning than either of them expected. Vincent remembered exactly how Evelyn preferred her tea prepared, always placing one spoonful of honey into the warm cup before handing it to her with a gentle smile. Naomi quietly noticed that Vincent never walked into the hospital without first greeting every nurse working the evening shift, thanking them sincerely for caring for her grandmother. Those simple habits slowly became part of a routine that felt surprisingly natural. One Saturday afternoon, Evelyn's condition improved enough for the doctors to allow her a brief visit to the hospital courtyard. Volunteers had filled the garden with colorful flowers, comfortable benches, and cheerful music drifting softly through the spring air. Naomi helped her grandmother settle comfortably beneath the shade of a flowering dogwood tree, while Vincent carried a small picnic basket prepared by the estate kitchen. The three of them spent nearly 2 hours talking, laughing, and sharing memories that seemed to erase the quiet worry surrounding the hospital walls. Evelyn watched the way Vincent patiently adjusted her wheelchair whenever the sunlight became too bright, and how Naomi instinctively reached for his hand while stepping across an uneven stone pathway without even realizing she had done so. Neither of them reacted. Their hands remained together naturally for several peaceful moments before Naomi slowly noticed and quietly smiled with slight embarrassment. Vincent simply smiled back without making her feel uncomfortable. Evelyn observed everything with gentle understanding, but chose not to interrupt the quiet happiness unfolding before her eyes. Later that afternoon, after Evelyn returned to her room for a short rest, Naomi and Vincent remained in the courtyard watching children play near the fountain. Naomi softly admitted that she almost forgot none of this had been real. The words escaped before she had time to stop them. Vincent looked toward the rippling water, remaining thoughtful for several seconds before answering that sometimes the heart recognized sincerity long before the mind accepted it. His reply lingered gently between them without demanding an explanation. That evening, after returning to the estate, Vincent found himself walking through the library where Naomi had first asked him the impossible question. He paused beside the same oak table, remembering the fear in her eyes that rainy night, and comparing it with the peaceful smile she had worn that afternoon beside her grandmother. For the first time in many years, he realized his thoughts no longer revolved around business meetings or responsibilities waiting for the following morning. Instead, they returned again and again to one woman whose kindness quietly transformed every room she entered. At the very same moment, Naomi stood beside her apartment window overlooking the quiet neighborhood where she had lived most of her life. She caught herself smiling while remembering Vincent laughing with Evelyn over stories from decades ago. The realization startled her. She had promised herself never to mistake gratitude for affection, Yet the warmth growing inside her heart no longer resembled gratitude alone. Neither of them spoke those feelings aloud because both believed the arrangement would soon end when Evelyn recovered enough to return home. Yet somewhere beneath their shared silence, the simple promise that had begun with compassion was slowly becoming something neither of them had ever planned, and neither heart seemed willing to turn away from it anymore. Several weeks later, the hospital room that had once echoed with uncertainty now felt brighter with quiet hope. Evelyn Carter continued growing stronger each day, and her doctors believed she would soon be well enough to return home with regular medical support. Naomi Carter should have felt nothing but relief, yet every encouraging update carried another realization she had tried not to acknowledge. The promise she and Vincent DeLuca had made would soon come to its natural conclusion. The reason that had first brought them together was slowly disappearing, and with it came the uncomfortable question neither of them seemed ready to answer. One peaceful afternoon, after helping Evelyn finish lunch, Naomi stepped into the hospital courtyard alone while Vincent remained inside speaking with one of the physicians about home care arrangements. Spring flowers had fully blossomed across the gardens, and families gathered beneath flowering trees, grateful for ordinary moments that once felt impossible. Naomi watched them quietly, wondering why the happiness surrounding her suddenly felt mixed with sadness. She reminded herself that Vincent had fulfilled every promise he made. He had given her grandmother peace, kindness, respect, and memories that would remain precious forever. Expecting anything beyond that would be unfair. By the time Vincent joined her outside, Naomi had already decided that when Evelyn returned home, she would thank him sincerely and gently bring their arrangement to an end. They walked slowly through the garden paths without speaking for several minutes. Finally, Naomi stopped beside a small pond where sunlight shimmered across the water and softly admitted that she believed it was time for them to prepare for goodbye. Vincent looked at her with quiet surprise, but did not interrupt. She explained that her grandmother was recovering well, that the promise had been fulfilled, and that she would never forget everything he had done for her family. She smiled warmly, determined not to allow tears to accompany words meant to express gratitude. Vincent remained silent for a long moment before asking whether ending the arrangement was truly what she wanted or simply what she believed she owed him. Naomi hesitated because the honest answer frightened her. Before she could respond, Evelyn's nurse appeared in the garden to let them know her grandmother was asking to see them both. Inside the room, Evelyn welcomed them with the same gentle smile that had comforted Naomi throughout her entire life. Looking from one face to the other, she quietly admitted that she had known almost from the beginning that their relationship had started under unusual circumstances. Naomi's heart nearly stopped. She immediately apologized for misleading her, but Evelyn softly squeezed her hand before she could continue. With peaceful eyes, she explained that love built upon kindness never looked rehearsed, while pretending always carried fear. What she had witnessed during every visit was not perfection but genuine care, quiet respect, patient listening, and two people who instinctively made each other's lives lighter. She smiled tenderly before saying that no performance could create those things. Vincent lowered his eyes thoughtfully, deeply moved by her words. Evelyn then asked for only one promise from both of them. She said that when the time came to make decisions about their future, they should never choose out of obligation, guilt, or gratitude. They should choose only what brought peace to their own hearts. As the afternoon sunlight filled the room with gentle warmth, Naomi realized that the hardest part of their journey was no longer pretending to be husband and wife. It was discovering whether the feelings quietly growing between them had already become too real to leave behind when the promise finally reached its end. 2 days later, Evelyn Carter was finally discharged from the hospital beneath a bright blue spring sky that seemed to celebrate alongside everyone who cared for her. Naomi Carter helped settle her grandmother into the small house where she had grown up, carefully arranging fresh flowers on the dining table, while neighbors stopped by with homemade meals and warm wishes for her recovery. Vincent DeLuca quietly carried several boxes inside, without allowing anyone else to lift the heavier items. Although the afternoon was filled with grateful smiles and gentle laughter, Naomi could not ignore the quiet truth waiting beneath every pleasant conversation. The promise that had brought Vincent into their lives had now been fulfilled. As evening approached and the last visitor left, Naomi stood on the front porch watching the sunset paint the neighborhood in shades of gold and amber. Vincent walked toward his car after saying goodbye to Evelyn, but before opening the driver's door he paused, sensing someone standing behind him. Naomi approached slowly, her hands folded together as though gathering the courage for one final conversation. She thanked him once again for everything he had done, not only for her grandmother, but also for giving their family memories that would never fade. Her voice remained calm, yet Vincent noticed the sadness she carefully tried to hide behind every word. She quietly explained that now Evelyn was safely home, there was no longer any reason for him to continue carrying a responsibility that had never truly belonged to him. She wished him happiness and admitted she hoped someday someone would appreciate his kindness the way he deserved. Vincent listened without interrupting. When she finished speaking, he simply nodded with quiet respect, knowing that arguing in that moment would only make her believe she had become another obligation he felt compelled to protect. He wished Evelyn continued health, thanked Naomi for trusting him when she had nowhere else to turn, and drove away beneath the fading evening light. The following days felt strangely unfamiliar to both of them. Naomi returned to her regular responsibilities at the DeLuca estate, expecting life to return to normal, yet every hallway reminded her of conversations they had shared while driving to the hospital. Every library shelf reminded her of the impossible questions she had asked, and every quiet evening seemed far too silent without their routine visits. She caught herself turning toward the front entrance each afternoon before remembering there was no reason to expect Vincent to arrive looking for her anymore. Across the city, Vincent discovered that his carefully organized schedule no longer distracted him the way it once had. Meetings ended, documents were signed, and responsibilities continued exactly as before, yet every accomplishment felt strangely incomplete. During one board meeting, he found himself staring absent-mindedly through the conference room window after noticing a flowering dogwood tree that reminded him of the hospital courtyard where Naomi had laughed beside her grandmother. His closest advisor quietly asked whether something was troubling him. Vincent answered honestly that for the first time in many years, he could no longer convince himself that work alone was enough to fill a life. That evening, he returned to the estate and wandered into the library without consciously deciding to do so. The room remained exactly as it had been on the rainy night when Naomi first gathered the courage to ask for help. Standing beside the same oak table, Vincent finally admitted what he had refused to say aloud. Somewhere between a promise made out of compassion and countless ordinary moments shared with quiet sincerity, he had stopped pretending long before anyone else realized it. The only person who still believed their story had ended was the woman who had unknowingly become the place his heart wanted to return to every single day. The following afternoon, Naomi Carter finished arranging fresh linens inside the east wing of the DeLuca estate when one of the senior housekeepers quietly informed her that Vincent DeLuca wished to see her in the library before leaving for an evening meeting. Her heart skipped for reasons she refused to examine too closely. During the past several days, they had spoken only about ordinary responsibilities. Carefully avoiding the conversation both of them knew could no longer remain unfinished. Naomi paused outside the familiar wooden doors, took one steady breath, and stepped inside. The library looked exactly as it had on the rainy evening when she first gathered the courage to ask for help. Sunlight now streamed through the tall windows instead of rain, casting warm light across the polished oak table where everything had begun. Vincent stood beside the shelves holding a small velvet box in one hand. When Naomi approached, he gently placed the box upon the table between them. She looked at it with quiet confusion before slowly opening the lid. Inside rested the simple wedding band she had worn during their visits with Evelyn Carter. It was never expensive, chosen only because it looked natural enough to support the promise they had made together. Naomi carefully lifted the ring before offering it back with a soft smile. She thanked Vincent once more for allowing her grandmother to believe her final wish had come true and explained that the ring had served its purpose. Vincent looked at the band resting in her open palm but made no effort to take it. Instead, he calmly asked why she believed every meaningful chapter in life had to end the moment its original purpose was fulfilled. Naomi lowered her eyes, quietly admitting that she understood the difference between gratitude and love, and she never wanted him to feel trapped by kindness. She explained that the world they came from was completely different. He carried responsibilities larger than most people could imagine, while she was simply a woman who cleaned rooms, cared for others, and tried to live with dignity. Vincent listened patiently before walking toward the library window overlooking the peaceful gardens. Without turning around, he told Naomi that titles had never impressed him nearly as much as character. He had spent years surrounded by influential people who knew how to command attention, yet rarely offered compassion. Then he slowly turned to face her and admitted that she had quietly changed the atmosphere of every place she entered simply by choosing kindness when no one expected recognition. Naomi felt tears gathering despite every effort to remain composed. She whispered that those words meant more than he could possibly know, yet she still believed it was best for both of them to remember their time together with gratitude instead of unrealistic hope. She placed the ring back inside the velvet box and gently pushed it toward him across the table. Vincent looked down at the small box for several silent moments before calmly sliding it back across the polished wood until it rested once again before Naomi. His voice remained steady as he quietly said he could accept many endings in life, but accepting a future that required pretending he felt nothing was one ending he simply could not choose. Naomi looked into his eyes, searching for certainty, only to discover complete honesty waiting there without hesitation. Neither of them moved. The library became perfectly silent except for the distant ticking of the grandfather clock, and in that peaceful stillness, both understood that the next words spoken between them would determine not only the future of their relationship, but also whether the promise that had begun with compassion would finally become the truth both hearts had already started believing. Neither Naomi Carter nor Vincent DeLuca spoke for several long moments after his quiet confession settled into the silence of the library. The old grandfather clock continued marking each passing second while the late afternoon sun painted golden light across the polished wooden floor. Naomi looked at the simple wedding band resting inside the velvet box and slowly realized that the object itself had never carried the true meaning of their journey. It was only a reminder of the promise that had brought two strangers together and revealed a future neither of them had expected to find. She lifted her eyes toward Vincent, searching for uncertainty, but found only calm sincerity. He stepped closer, leaving enough space for her to choose freely. His voice remained gentle as he admitted that the first night she asked him for help, he believed he was offering compassion to someone carrying an impossible burden. Somewhere along the way, however, he stopped counting hospital visits, stopped remembering where the arrangement ended, and started looking forward to every ordinary conversation they shared. He smiled softly before telling her that the happiest part of every day had never been pretending to be her husband. It had simply been standing beside her. Naomi felt tears quietly gathering, no longer from fear or sadness, but from the overwhelming relief of realizing she was no longer alone. She confessed that after saying goodbye outside her grandmother's house, she had spent every evening convincing herself to forget feelings she believed could never belong in her life. She had told herself that gratitude could easily disguise love, yet no matter how many times she repeated those words, her heart continued searching for the quiet kindness that had become her greatest source of peace. Vincent reached toward the velvet box, lifted the simple ring, and placed it gently into Naomi's open hand without saying anything else. For a brief moment, she looked at the small band before laughing softly through her tears. She remembered the rainy evening when she had stood in this very room asking the most impossible question of her life. Looking into Vincent's eyes, she smiled and quietly asked whether he remembered exactly what she had said that night. Vincent nodded with warmth that softened every trace of the guarded man the world believed it knew. Naomi repeated the words almost in a whisper. "Can you pretend to be my husband?" The library became perfectly still. Vincent gently closed her fingers around the ring before answering with the same quiet certainty that had guided every act of kindness throughout their journey. "I do not want to pretend anymore." He paused only long enough for the meaning to settle between them before smiling. "Forever." Naomi could not stop smiling as she stepped forward and wrapped both hands around his, no longer searching for reassurance because she had already found it. Several weeks later, Evelyn Carter sat beneath the blooming roses in her restored garden while watching Naomi and Vincent walk together through the front gate. The gentle smile on her face revealed that she needed no explanation. She simply welcomed Vincent into the family with quiet gratitude, knowing that the promise she once wished for her granddaughter had become something far more beautiful than either of them had planned. As spring slowly gave way to summer, life continued with its ordinary joys. Naomi remained the same compassionate woman who believed every person deserved dignity, while Vincent continued leading with quiet strength, never allowing power to become more important than kindness. Together, they established a neighborhood outreach program supporting caregivers, elderly residents, and families facing difficult seasons, believing the greatest blessings only grew when shared with others. Their story was never built upon grand speeches or impossible miracles. It was built upon patience, respect, honesty, and the courage to let compassion become love. And every time they passed through the library where everything had begun, they remembered that sometimes the smallest question asked with the most fragile hope can become the beginning of an answer that lasts forever.